The U.S. says this was a precision operation, a justice mission, a move for security. But the rest of the world is treating it like something else entirely, a line that was crossed. On January 3, 2026, U.S. forces seized Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro in Caracas and flew him to the United States to face drug-related charges, sparking global condemnation and a legal storm at the United Nations over sovereignty and the use of force. Reuters, +2. AP News, +2. Now zoom out. Venezuela isn't just any country. It sits on the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, a resource that has shaped empires, toppled governments, and rewritten alliances. So here's the real question this story raises. Was this about courts and cartels, or about currencies and control? Because when oil is priced in one currency, that currency becomes more than money. It becomes infrastructure, leverage, a global toll booth. And if countries believe the toll booth is enforced with force, not trust, then the reaction won't be obedience. It will be acceleration toward alternatives. Let's break down how we got here, what it signals, and what it could change next. Venezuela is not just another political crisis on the map. It's a strategic node in the global energy system. For decades, its oil-fed refineries, its contracts shaped trade routes, and its pricing choices affected how energy flows were financed. The reason is simple. Oil isn't only fuel. Oil is collateral. Oil is liquidity. Oil is the commodity that countries can't ignore. That's why Venezuela's reserve base matters. When a nation holds the world's biggest proven reserves, it becomes a long-term bargaining chip for whoever can influence production, infrastructure, and export relationships. Dawn. Now add a second layer. Oil sales aren't just about barrels, they're about settlement. Which banks clear the payments, which currency is demanded, which systems get used. That's where the Petrodollar argument comes in. If major oil trade is settled in dollars, global demand for dollars stays structurally high. But if more oil trade starts settling in other currencies, the automatic demand weakens, and the geopolitical center of gravity shifts. So, when a major oil state changes settlement patterns, or appears to try, people don't react like it's a normal trade tweak. They react like a strategic signal has been fired. On January 3, 2026, the U.S. carried out a special forces operation in Venezuela that resulted in the capture of President Nicolás Maduro and his transfer to the United States. Inside the U.S., the framing is legal: an indictment, drug trafficking charges, and the language of law enforcement. Outside the U.S., the framing is geopolitical: sovereignty, precedent, and the fear that military force is being used to decide political outcomes. The UN Secretary General warned it sets a dangerous precedent, and legal experts cited UN charter issues around the use of force without authorization or valid self-defense grounds. That split, arrest versus abduction, operation versus invasion, isn't just semantics. It determines how other capitals interpret risk. Because if a head of state can be physically removed under a justice justification, then every government that sits in a gray zone with Washington starts recalculating. How safe are our reserves? How safe are our payment rails? How safe is our leadership if we cross the wrong line? Switzerland's decision to freeze assets linked to Maduro after his arrest shows how quickly the financial perimeter can move when politics turns kinetic. And once fear becomes the motivator, systems change faster than diplomacy. Most people think reserve currency is an abstract badge. In reality, it's plumbing. A dominant currency becomes dominant because the world uses it to settle large-scale trade. Energy is the biggest of those pipes. If oil contracts are mostly settled in dollars, then dollars become the default lubricant of global commerce. Banks hold them, central banks stockpile them, corporations invoice in them, and governments buy U.S. debt as a parking place. This creates 4 structural advantages for the issuer: constant global demand for the currency, cheaper borrowing via deep bond markets, more influence over the payment system, the ability to export inflation outward. But there's a hidden 5th advantage: enforcement power. When trade flows through your rails, currency settlement, correspondent banking, sanctions architecture, you gain the ability to punish, isolate, or freeze. That's why de-dollarization is not just ideological, it's defensive. Countries don't pursue alternatives because they hate the dollar. They pursue alternatives because they don't want a single foreign capital to control the off switch. So when Venezuela becomes the stage for a dramatic escalation, the core market question becomes, does this action increase trust in the system or reveal the system is maintained by pressure? If the world decides it's pressure, then the desire to build exits intensifies. To understand why this moment hits so hard, you have to see the long arc. Under Hugo Chavez, Venezuela pushed a message of economic sovereignty, more state control, less dependence on U.S. institutions, and deeper ties with non-Western partners. That didn't automatically mean anti-dollar, but it did mean diversification, especially in who financed projects, who bought the oil, and what political bloc Venezuela leaned into. After Chavez, Nicolás Maduro inherited the same strategic posture, but with less economic room to maneuver and more international pressure. Over time, sanctions and restrictions pushed Venezuela to seek whatever trade channels still worked. That naturally encouraged workarounds, bilateral deals, alternative settlement arrangements, and non-traditional counterparties. Whether you view those moves as survival tactics or political choices, they had one consistent outcome. The relationship between Venezuela and the U.S.-led financial perimeter became more confrontational. And in high-stakes energy geopolitics, confrontation has a predictable loop. Restrictions tighten, workarounds expand, enforcement escalates, more countries quietly study exits. That's why the Maduro capture isn't being read as a single incident. It's being read as a punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence, one that tells other states, if you drift far enough, the response won't stay economic. To understand why this moment hits so hard, you have to see the long arc. Under Hugo Chavez, Venezuela pushed a message of economic sovereignty, more state control, less dependence on U.S. institutions, and deeper ties with non-Western partners. That didn't automatically mean anti-dollar, but it did mean diversification, especially in who financed projects, who bought the oil, and what political bloc Venezuela leaned into. After Chavez, Nicolás Maduro inherited the same strategic posture, but with less economic room to maneuver and more international pressure. Over time, sanctions and restrictions pushed Venezuela to seek whatever trade channels still worked. That naturally encouraged workarounds, bilateral deals, alternative settlement arrangements, and non-traditional counterparties. Whether you view those moves as survival tactics or political choices, they had one consistent outcome. The relationship between Venezuela and the U.S.-led financial perimeter became more confrontational. And in high-stakes energy geopolitics, confrontation has a predictable loop. Restrictions tighten, workarounds expand, enforcement escalates, more countries quietly study exits. That's why the Maduro capture isn't being read as a single incident. It's being read as a punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence, one that tells other states, if you drift far enough, the response won't stay economic. Here's the key shift in the modern world. Economic tools often arrive before military tools. Sanctions, asset freezes, shipping restrictions, and payment bans can throttle a state's trade without firing a shot. But they also teach the target, and every observer, exactly where the vulnerabilities are. When sanctions hit energy exporters, the pressure concentrates on the same choke points every time. Insurance, shipping finance, payment clearing, spare parts and maintenance supply chains, access to hard currency liquidity. The moment those choke points are activated, a country has two options: submit and re-enter the approved system, or improvise an alternative route. Improvisation can look messy: barter deals, third-party intermediaries, new payment rails, but it has one long-term effect. It builds muscle memory outside the dominant system. So if the world reads Venezuela as sanctions did not force compliance, then the next step, physical seizure of leadership, looks like escalation, not resolution. And escalation is contagious, not because countries want conflict, but because they want insurance. Insurance in geopolitics means options: multiple buyers, multiple currencies, multiple clearing routes, multiple security partners. When enforcement becomes visible, the market value of alternatives rises. The biggest impact of a high-profile intervention is rarely the immediate headline. It's the precedent. At the UN, the legality of the U.S. capture is now being scrutinized, with experts warning it undermines norms around sovereignty and head-of-state protections. That matters because the global financial system runs on credibility, not morality, credibility. Rules that powerful countries follow create predictability. When predictability cracks, risk premiums rise. And energy is the first place risk shows up. Oil prices move not only on supply and demand, but on what could go wrong next. If producers fear they can become targets, they demand higher returns and more diversified settlement options. If buyers fear shipping lanes and sanctions, they lock in alternative routes and build stockpiles. If central banks fear asset freezes, they diversify reserves. This is how you get a chain reaction where the system starts decoupling in slow motion. More trade in non-dollar currencies, more regional clearing systems, more bilateral swap lines, more reserve diversification. No single step kills dollar dominance, but each step removes one brick from the wall. And once enough bricks are removed, the wall doesn't fall dramatically, it simply stops being the only wall in town. There's a difference between private hedging and public coordination. Private hedging is quiet. A central bank buys more gold, reduces exposure, signs a small bilateral deal. Public coordination is louder. Blocs announce new payment arrangements, energy settlement experiments, or shared financial infrastructure. Venezuela's crisis has become a global meeting point for that coordination because it touches three sensitive nerves at once: energy sovereignty, leadership security, reserve safety. That combination can push countries that don't even like each other to cooperate simply because their incentives align. You don't need a new world currency tomorrow for the shift to begin. You only need enough countries to agree on one principle: we want options. Options can be as simple as accepting partial settlement in another currency for a specific buyer, or creating a clearing mechanism that bypasses traditional routes for a subset of trade, or expanding regional payment networks that reduce reliance on a single system. The key point: once fear becomes common, coordination becomes easier, because fear reduces the political cost of doing what previously seemed unthinkable. And that's the irony. The more aggressively a system is enforced, the more urgently other players build escape ladders. Let's be careful here. No serious analyst can forecast exact prices or dates with certainty. Anyone promising a precise timeline is selling emotion. But we can explain the mechanics that matter to everyday people. If the dollar's role in commodity settlement weakens over time, the U.S. loses some of the automatic demand that has historically supported deep borrowing capacity. That doesn't mean collapse overnight, it means the cushion gets thinner. A thinner cushion changes the trade-offs. Servicing debt can become more expensive. Importing goods can become less cheap relative to domestic production. Inflation sensitivity rises because less demand supports the currency externally. Energy volatility hits consumers faster. So the practical risk isn't the dollar disappears. The practical risk is that Americans feel the adjustment through higher price instability and less room for policy mistakes. That's why geopolitics matters to groceries and gas. Energy is priced globally. Shipping is global. Industrial inputs are global. Currency confidence is global. And when a credibility shock hits the global system, households don't get a vote. They get the bill. Slowly, then suddenly, then all at once. Here's the modern model. Power isn't built by conquest alone. It's built by combining finance and security into one package. A dominant power offers market access, capital access, security partnerships, financial infrastructure. In exchange, partners align, settle trade in preferred ways, and hold preferred reserves. A rising challenger offers the same thing, but with different terms: alternative financing, alternative payment rails, alternative settlement options, and sometimes protection through alliances or strategic backing. That's why countries choose sides less like ideology and more like insurance underwriting. The Venezuela event hardens this logic. If leaders believe the penalty for stepping out of line can include extreme measures, they start shopping for a counterweight. And that's how systems shift, not because one side is perfect, but because the other side begins to look risky. So the question isn't, will the world abandon the dollar tomorrow? The question is, how many countries decide they want a parallel track so they're never trapped? When parallel tracks become normal, dominance becomes optional. And when dominance becomes optional, it becomes fragile. Forget the slogans, forget the press conferences. This entire story is about one invisible asset: confidence. If the world believes the dollar system is stable, predictable, and rules-based, it remains the easiest hub to use. But if the world believes the system is enforced through coercion and can turn on allies or adversaries without warning, then countries don't just complain, that diversify. And diversification is irreversible once it reaches scale. Because once a country builds new rails, settlement routes, reserve strategy, trade partners, it won't voluntarily rebuild dependence. The Maduro capture has pushed that psychological shift into the open, and even the UN debate is highlighting the deeper issue: norms and precedent. Reuters. That's why this moment matters even if Venezuela never becomes a major exporter tomorrow. The message has already traveled. Every oil exporter, every central bank, every trade ministry is now asking, what happens if we're next? And then they ask the follow-up that changes history. How do we make sure we're not? That's how reserve systems weaken, not with a single announcement, but with 1,000 quiet decisions made in fear. If you only remember one thing from this video, make it this. Reserve systems don't die when people hate them. They die when people stop trusting them. And what happened in early January 2026 isn't just a Venezuela story. It's a signal to every country that relies on the same global pipes. The UN debate isn't theater. It's a preview of what the next decade could revolve around: sovereignty, settlement, and the race to build alternatives. Now, this is not financial advice, but it is a reality check. If you want to understand where energy prices, inflation pressure, and global trade are heading, you can't ignore the currency layer anymore, because the moment oil settlement becomes multipolar at scale, the world's economic balance shifts, and everyday costs shift with it. So here's what I want you to do. Subscribe if you want clear, step-by-step breakdowns of geopolitics, money, and power, without the fluff. Comment the one question you want answered next. What happens after a precedent like this? And in the next video, we'll map the real scoreboard. Who's building alternative payment rails? Which energy exporters are experimenting with settlement changes? And what the confidence war looks like when it hits markets. Because the biggest moves happen before the headlines catch up.